Back. This is Kimberly Purpose and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to do another video about the Creek Indians. I did a part, I guess this would be part two, because I found another article on the New Georgia Encyclopedia. Sorry, excuse me for that. And this article was quite interesting. It caught my eye. It's called The English Trade in Deerskins and Indian Slaves. I like this article because it goes more into depth as to what happened during the slave trade among the Indians. And it's everything, it was, every time I do research, it just seems like it's very vague in describing as to what exactly happened to the Indians. I hear articles, I read articles in some places, and that says in some books that they just miraculously disappeared. But I'm sorry, but this article goes more into detail. And this article is written by Robbie Etheridge at University of Mississippi. And this article was published in 2002. This is an old article again. Now, some things probably do need to be updated, especially with new current research. But it was edited by Chris Dobbs. But I'm going to read it. We're going to see if it's better than the other article. Here's some artwork at the top of the page, and I'm going to go ahead and start. It says here, when the English came into America, the Native Americans of Georgia encountered one of the most profound forces. One of the most profound forces for change, the world economy. European merchants ushered in this new economic system with the commercial trade in dressed animal skins, but even more so with the commercial trade in enslaved Indians. See? The slave trade began northeastern in America and spread quickly. It was profound effects of Native Americans in Georgia from its beginning in the first half of the 17th century through the full incorporation of Georgia Indians into the trade by the late 17th century and until English trade interests turned to buying and selling the skins of white-tailed deers in the early 18th century. See, they trying to cover this up, but they enslaved a bunch of Indians. It's right here. Commercial trade in enslaved Indians. See? If y'all didn't read that, I'm going to read this sentence again. It says, economic merchants ushered in this new economic system with a commercial trade in dressed animal skins, but even more so with the commercial trade in enslaved Indians. Okay? That is very important. They're acknowledging the fact the Indians were enslaved here. And so the AKA African Americans are actually the indigenous Indians here on this land in the Americas. This sentence alone pretty much speaks volumes, and it's telling you right here that the Indians were the slaves. They were prisoners of war. That's exactly what happened. See, that's why I wanted to share this article with you all. And it tells you right there. But let's continue. Forces for change. At the time of English settlement in present-day Georgia, Native Americans of the South already went into a profound process of transformation that began when they encountered first Europeans. One of the first forces for change was epidemic disease. Within a decade of the conquistador Hernando de Soto, for his army of 600 made their way through the regions in the mid-16th century. The powerful chieftains of the late prehistoric time began to collapse. Archaeologists believe that the demise of these societies were due in part of the devastating populations lost for disease. So they say. See, so they say. They say it's disease. But history has been so whitewashed and changed around. We have been lied to by Europeans so long that you can't believe everything that they say. I don't believe all the Indians died out like they claim they did. I believe slavery started prior to the 1600s. I believe it started in the 1500s when they first got here. I think they were killing people. They were doing mass genocide. It might not have been just by disease because these people did not have guns. They had bows and arrows, and maybe um, axes and stuff like that. But they didn't have the weaponry like the Europeans did. So it was easier for them to come in here and just gun down people. So I think that they killed more people than they say they are doing. They did. They just blame it on disease. It would be interesting to see, to do more research. Any archaeologists could actually go and look at remains of the Aborigines and see what exactly happened. Did it really happen with disease, or did it happen with mass killings? And I believe it was mass. If you do a comparison of how many slaves were enslaved during that time period, really that's sort of hard to do because they didn't keep no records of the slaves back then because they still trying to keep this narrative. But I'm also wondering maybe if we could see how many slaves was going into the Caribbean, because I believe a lot of slaves were going into the Caribbean and reclassified as black and sent out, since history has been told in reverse. According to history books, they said that slaves were brought in from Africa, but in actuality, they were sending out the Aborigines here in the Americas out to other countries. That's what was happening. That they were kidnapping and sending people into the Caribbean and then shipping them out to other countries. That's exactly what happened. But let's continue. In interior Georgia, McCoskey speaking, survivors of collapse abandoned large areas and began joining together in certain areas of aggregation. One such area centered along the Piedmont stretch of the Oconee River, and another along the upper coastal plain section of Chattahoochee River. Native Americans who lived in coastal Georgia and the Barrier Islands fell under another forced change, Spanish missionaries. After the establishment of St. Augustine, Florida in 1565, Catholic missionaries labored along the Gale and Macama of Georgia coast and the Apache Tacoma at present day North Florida. See, I'm looking at these dates, 1565. They got here in the 1500s. They were enslaving folks then. And they say they reached Georgia and Florida and part of Georgia. So, yeah, that's what they were doing. Slavery started before the 1600s, like they claim it did. It really did. But let's continue. How the Indian slave trade worked. Native Americans transformed by the new trading system. It was a commercial trade dressed in animal skins, and Indians' slavery was unknown to the indigenous people of eastern woodlands, and they practiced a version of the time contact with English traders. Once slaves became something to be bought and sold. However, a powerful new dynamic began shaping the lives of Georgia Indians. See? It says once slaves became something to be bought and sold, however, a powerful new dynamic began shaping the lives of Georgia Indians. So here you go, right here. They changed the meaning of slavery when they started enslaving them. See, it was unknown. It says right here, slavery was unknown to the indigenous people of the eastern woodlands, and they practiced a version of at the time of contact in English traders. So they were not used to this new trading system that they were doing here in the Americas. It was something totally new, and yeah, it's not a good thing. But let's continue. English traders would give European-made guns and ammunition to a group of Indians and demand that the guns be paid for with slaves. See, that's how they trick back them, saying that they won't give them guns unless they gave slaves. They trick backing them to give up their people, their own people. And see, that's so sad. The armed groups would then raid unarmed group, now vulnerable to Indians, slave raiders, who would thus need guns and ammunition protection and would acquire them. The native people depend on the Europeans' trade of flintlock guns as well as for shot and powder. Therefore, anyone needing guns had to become a slave raider. In this way, as a cycle of dependency emergency emerged. Okay. See, they became dependent on the guns from the Europeans, and that's why they started trading themselves. Wow, this alone is what started the slave trade, but I don't think the Indians kept it going. They probably eventually realized what they were doing and didn't want to do it no more. But I still think Europeans were the main person behind doing the the slave trade. I think they were doing a lot of kidnapping. But let's continue. Indian slave raiders captured slaves, most women, and Indian slave raiders were not just Indians. I believe Europeans were all involved in it too. I don't think it was just the Indians. I really do believe European was the main force behind it. The Greys, the Gray people were the ones who were behind it. Yeah, they used them initially, but I think eventually the Indians opened their eyes and realized that's when the battle started taking place. They realized what they were doing. They didn't want to do it no more, and that's when they started getting more angry and want to take over. And well, they push it because they were making so much money off the Indians, which are are the AKA African Americans, the Aborigines. But let's continue. It says Indian slave raids captured slaves, mostly women and children, by the thousands and sold them to English, French, and Dutch slavers who shipped them to sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Although some certainly went to the new coastal plains in Virginia, South Carolina, and French Louisiana. See? That's all they did. They kidnapped the women and children. The slave trade was about capturing the Indians and putting them in slavery. That is what happened. They did not take nobody from Africa. Everybody here, the Aborigines, the AKA African Americans, are the Indians. And that's all they did was kidnap the women and children. Now, I want to look up something real quick. I looked this up on the online etymology dictionary. Don't know if y'all can see it, sort of shiny. But anyway, I want to give you all the definition of what kidnap mean. Because this is a bunch of bull where they trying to pull the wool over our eyes. It's telling us right here that they kidnapped the women and children, the indigenous women and children. These are the slaves, the AKA African Americans. We are the descendants of the Indians on the East Coast of the United States of America. So this is our identity here. This is who we are right here. Then it says here in the online etymology dictionary, it says 1680s, thieves camped, a compound of kidnap, child, and nap, snatch away, which probably is a variant of nap, perhaps a back formation from kidnapper, which is recorded earlier, originally to steal children to provide as servants or laborers in the American colonies. So they kidnapped the children. The children they kidnapped were the Aborigines. They don't put who they were, but everybody know that the Aborigines were the only ones that were getting kidnapped and thrown into slavery. Europeans weren't being kidnapped like that. It was the natives, the Aborigines that were here, which is us, the African Americans. We were the ones that were kidnapped and thrown into slavery. This is our homeland, you guys. Y'all got to realize this is our land. So we need to identify ourselves as Aborigines and stop calling ourselves African Americans. This paragraph alone tells you right here exactly what happened. For most Native groups already seriously weakened by loss from disease, slaving was a serious blow. See? Of course, they came in, they did a mass killing with disease and also probably shooting them up, just killing them, with guns. And then they started slaving them. That's exactly what happened. Wherever slavery penetrated, the same process unfolded. Many Indian groups moved to escape slave raiders. And the slave raiders were not just Native people. They tried to make it look like it was just Native Indians doing it. Europeans was the power force behind slavery. European whites were over here, grays, I meant to say. The gray people were over here enslaving the slaves. The the Greys were the slave raiders. Okay, they were kidnapping children. It wasn't just the Indians. The Europeans were doing it too, and I believe they were the main ones doing it. I think the Indians got the gist of what they were doing and stopped doing it. So, but they want to continue doing it because they were making money off people, off of free labor, our people. And see, this right here tells you incriminating evidence. We're going to add it. Some groups joined others in an effort to bolster their numbers and present a stronger defense. Some groups became extinct over after losses to disease and slave raiding. See, that's what happened. The people did not disappear in the 1600s. They did not disappear. The Aborigines did not disappear. They died from disease. They died from being killed. And they also died from the slave raids. And those who were left behind became part of the slave trade. So that's all they did. Like I said before, let's shed more light. And this is exactly what happened to us. And then all they did was reclassify the Indians as blacks or Negroes. That's all they did. They didn't do nothing special. They didn't bring nobody out from no Africa. And it says, slaving in Georgia. The trade in Native American slaves first began in the Northeast. The Iroquois, seeking access to Europe, good and war captives whom they adopted into their king groups to replace their dead, began doing business with English, French, and Dutch traders in the first decades of the 17th century. Almost immediately, this trade created a shadow zone of regional instability from which stock waves radiated out the hundreds of miles. The Indians of Georgia certainly felt those stock waves, since some Iroquois raiders probably raided into North Georgia, and since many of the northern groups suffered under Iroquois raids, began to break up and move along distances west and south seeking refuge. So that's what's happening. But they still try to blame the Indians. It wasn't just the Indians doing this, and it was the English, French, and Dutch traders. They were the ones behind it. And I don't think the Indians were the only one kidnapping folks. I think the Europeans were going in these villages and were kidnapping people too. It was a collaborative effort, and they always try to paint the narrative that Indians were the only one, but they behinds was over there doing it too. I bet you they were in there with guns and chasing down people and throwing them in a slave trade. That's all they did. Europeans are too lazy. Greys are too lazy to do anything else. They couldn't even get the people. They couldn't even do their own plantation. And they stole the knowledge from the indigenous people. And that's why they wanted the people along the coast, the East Coast, because they had farms. And they stole the land from the folks. They were too lazy and obviously not smart enough to figure out how to plant their own stuff. So they didn't do anything. Very lazy, selfish groups of people that came in here and stole from the indigenous people. But let's continue. Slaving in the South, however, probably did not become fully established until sometime in the late 17th century, when Jamestown traders recognized the need for slaves to work the tobacco plantations, engaged Piedmont groups like the Oconnees, and the Turaquaras as slave raiders. Oh my gosh. Like the Iroquois, these Piedmont slavers first raided among the enemies close at hand. During this time, Cherokee-speaking people living in the southern Appalachians may have moved southwest, away from the slave raiders, with some perhaps moving into the areas of North Georgia and had been vacated during the collapse of the chieftains. See, this is what I'm talking about. The Indians had to be no other than Aborigines, dark-skinned black people. So why would the Cherokee move away and worry about being enslaved? Cherokee Indians were blacks. All these people were blacks, Aborigines. They were not the Mongoloids, okay? And then we need to get that out of our head. The East Coast were black Indians, okay? The first Indians that were part of contact by the Europeans were black. They were not Mongoloids. Mongoloids were further north. They were mostly in Canada. They were not over here, okay? They might have been towards the west part, maybe. That's pushing it. but they were not on the East Coast during the first initial contact, which happened in the 1600s. And this is what happened. And Cherokee Indian are not these grays that's in today's what do you call it, Oklahoma. They are European settlers that took our identity. Okay, Cherokees are the Aborigines, which are people that look like me. Cherokee and Creek are the real Indians. Okay, and we had identity theft of the Europeans during the Dawes Commission, but and the lands that they stole are not theirs; it's really ours. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that Cherokee people, why would they run away? Okay, why would you, if you white, a European looking person, you wouldn't have no reason to run away. Obviously, they were black Aborigines. Okay, they were Aborigine people. Okay, they looked like the people that were thrown in the slave trade. Okay, so that's all they did was kidnap the indigenous people and threw them into slavery. This paragraph pretty much speaks for itself. It speaks volume as to exactly what happened. Okay, let's go on. It says, in the late 1650s, another group of Indians fleeing Iroquois slave raiding, probably the Erie, settled on the Savannah River. Here they became known as the Westos to the English and as the Chicamicos to the Spanish. The Westos were predatory slave raiders aligned with the English slavers in Virginia and heavily armed. See, that's all they did was capture people here in the lands in the Americas and enslave them. All this happened, like I said, during the 15 and the 1600s. They didn't bring no Africans over here. Okay, they didn't bring any. Okay, let's continue. In 1679, in their strategy of playing the English and the French off each other in an effort to replace hundreds who died of the epidemic, Iroquois slave raiders struck up to the west and east and south, thus becoming the Iroquois Southern campaign against the Flatheads. The term Iroquois applied to all of the southern groups because of their custom flattening of the backs of the infants at birth. The South Iroquois ranged far and wide. Their extent record documented presence in the Carolina, Piedmont, in Georgia and Alabama, in northern Florida, in Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. The Iroquois campaign lasted almost 40 years. The Westos' reign of terror lasted almost 20 years. So, so I guess it was a total of 60 years or so, 40 to 60 years perhaps, that this happened. So that's a lot of black people that Aborigines that they were capturing along the East Coast. So all the people that they were putting into the slave trade were not Africans. They were us. They were the Aborigines. That's all they did. So I'm going to have to scroll on down. This is a very long article. I didn't realize how long it was, but let's go down here. It says, by the time the Carolinas and Virginia traders also began to make contact with many of the natives in the interior of Georgia, approaching to the Cherokees and these groups who lived along the Cherokee River, both became slavers, and a later group moved to the Omochee River, present-day Macon, to be closer to English traders. Here they continued to take refuge and became known as the Ochesee Creek, forming the nucleus of people who became known as the Lower Creeks. Lower Creek slavers, along with Yamasee and Shawnee slavers, continued to target the mission of Indians in Florida, probably under English crusading by asserting their own benefit. Those a series of devastating slave raids, few remaining. The Comicans were forced to southern Florida and left to Cuba, the last remaining province of Mission Indians. The Apache were gone by 1704, when the handful of refugees who remained fled west to present-day Louisiana. Wow. So according to this, they saying that only the slave Indians were doing this. I don't think so. I really believe Europeans were going in themselves and doing this too. I think the vast majority were the Europeans, because the Yamasee, they start in the Creek Indians, if I'm not mistaken, was starting to fight against the Europeans. So this don't make no sense to me right here. Okay? This really don't. Because the Creeks and the Yamasee were the Indians that were fighting against the Europeans, the Greys. The Europeans. They were fighting them back. They were fighting them back because they were capturing their women and children and throwing them into slavery. So I don't think all this is factual. This is a point of opinion, or this whitewashing again to make it like Europeans and Greys didn't do anything wrong, but they did. They were the brainchild behind this thing. And I think maybe if they might have done it a few times to Indians, but then when they started realizing that they were kidnapping their women and children, what was happening, they probably started fighting back. And I believe that's what happened. And I think the Europeans came in and started kidnapping their children, women and children. That's all they were doing, and throwing them into slavery. That's exactly what happened. So I'm not inclined to believe all the stuff that Europeans are writing, because they have lied so much about everything in the slave trade. So more than likely, this is in reverse too. The Europeans came in and raided the villages and kidnapped the slaves. That's what I think happened. I think this is told in reverse. They're trying to make it like the Indians were all against it. Because if I'm not mistaken, the Yamasee and some of the other Indians came together, the Seminole came together to fight back. And the Creeks were fighting back. And so were the Cherokees at one time fighting back. So it just doesn't make any sense to me. It really doesn't. I think they did this on purpose to try to cover up the fact that the Europeans were coming in here stealing, kidnapping children and throwing them into slavery. Because it just wouldn't have been a big benefit for an Indian to be enslaving their own people all the time. Eventually they realize what's going on, especially when they see their kids going and their wives and mothers and whatever getting kidnapped and thrown into slavery. So yeah, that's what I think happened. I think they might have initially started off, but I believe that the Europeans had a big hold on it. And I think a lot of them were going into the villages and kidnapping people. I don't think it was just the Indians. I think mainly Europeans. They need to just go on and show the pictures of the Caucasians going in and kidnapping women and children and killing off the men. That's all they did. But let's continue. It says here, formation of the coalescent societies. Meanwhile, the same forces swept through the west and north of present-day Georgia. The native slavers trade with the English, French, and Dutch, raided far and wide throughout the eastern plainlands. The same process of dislocation and migration took place, and many groups band together. These new groups became known as the Catawbas and the Chickasaws and the Choctaws and the Upper Creeks, who later joined the Lower Creeks to form the Creek Confederacy. See, that's what I'm saying. They were coming together to fight back. And they were stealing their women and children. They were kidnapping them, which made perfect sense to me. We still lack an adequate vocabulary to describe the Indian societies of the 17th and 18th century. Yeah, because y'all lied about all this at the top of how the Indian, y'all were kidnapping them. The Europeans were kidnapping them and throwing them in slavery. They just need to blatantly say that as a fact and stop putting all this BS that Indians were doing all of this stuff. No, it was the Europeans that did this. And they probably put in lies and tried to get them to fight amongst themselves. And eventually they realized what happened and tried to fight back. But of course they're gonna put a lie on and whitewash everything to make it look like they didn't do anything wrong. But everything was done wrong by the Europeans. They shouldn't have done. They came over here taking over this land that's not theirs. As the coalescent societies began to form, the Native Americans in Georgia throughout the South revolted against the slave trade and the English in particular. This revolt, known as the Yamasee War of 1715, served the Indian purpose of reforming the trade, if an annihilating the English. Although Indian slaves continued to be bought and sold, the Yamasee War redirected English economic interests from Indian to the skins of white territories. Supposedly, slavery was still going on. It still went on in 1800, all the way up to the 18. It didn't come to an end until I believe like 1867, 64, 5, somewhere around there, the late 1800s. So they were still doing it more than likely. The natives had made it clear that the English that slaving on such a large scale was dangerous, and the English concluded the imported slaves from Africa was safer and more profitable. You're right. Yeah, right. I don't believe these slaves are from Africa. I think all they did was take the people from the Caribbeans that they originally sent over there in the first place and brought them back and classified them as African. That's another theory. Because they too lazy to go all the way to Africa to get these folks. They didn't have the technology back then to do it. It was just too far. And then I read different articles about how, the people were so sick from the long travel, they were near death or not healthy enough to work. So they were sickened from disease and malnourished. A 4-month travel on the ocean with no engine, no technology whatsoever, just wooden boat. It's just not feasible. Not in the 1700s. They didn't have the technology to do all this to bring in millions of people. So all this is just a lie. All they did was bring the people from the Caribbeans over, and those were Indians too. They were Aborigines too. The Indians of Georgia now fully incorporate into new economic system turned to deerskin trade as willing as a savvy participant. They kidnapped enough people during this time period from the 15 to 1700. That's 200 years. 200 years of enslavement, folks. That's a lot of people that they sent. So they had plenty of slaves in the Caribbean by then. So all they did was just bring them back. I don't think hardly no Africans came over. I think it's the same people. I really do. Well, let's continue. When General James Edward Elkerthorpe settled Savannah in 1733, the natives he encountered were quite different from the natives that Hernando de Soto had encountered 200 years earlier. Yeah, they were different even from the native people that Virginia traders encountered 100 years earlier. They were probably the half-breeds. Or the Mongoloids. They might have came down once it was they kidnapped all the indigenous people. Well, anyway, the Ogatham encountered greater cognizant societies of the late historic period. The Cherokees and Cree society were dealing with Europeans. These are the half-breeds more than likely. They put the half-breeds in charge. I was looking at the other, if you want to see the other video, I talked about, they showed the half-breeds that were in charge of the Cree. That's what happened. Some of them intermarried with these Europeans. And then I think the government just put Europeans in charge to make sure they disbanded the tribes. Because they didn't look like they were natives. They didn't look like Aborigines at all. They looked like just regular Italian looking white men. And that's all they did. They put a gray in there to take over. That's all they did. They put a gray in there and as leadership, and they dismantled the tribes. That's what, it looks different because they put Europeans in there, half-breeds and Europeans, and that's all they did, so they could try to rewrite the history books and say that we didn't exist at all. But societies quite experiencing and dealing with Europeans. These societies have been shaped by their experience with Europeans in response to the new world economy in which they were enmeshed. So this is the whole article. This article was pretty straightforward and to the point, which I really appreciate. I believe this particular person was a lot more accurate as to what happened and straight to the point. Robbie Etheridge did a pretty good job explaining what happened. The only thing I disagree with is the raids. They try to make it look like the slavers were only the Indians. I doubt that. I believe Europeans had a strong force into it. I think it was mostly Europeans coming into these villages and attacking people. I don't think it was the Indians. I don't think it was just the Indians. I think Europeans were the majority, main ones that was involved in it. Because they the main ones that benefit and profitize from it. So it just make more sense for them to be the main ones all in the middle of it. And I wouldn't be surprised if a bunch of them came in and had their guns and attacked the villages and were kidnapping people. I don't think it was just done the indigenous people. I think Europeans had a lot to do with it, and I think they went in there as slave raiders. I personally believe that what thing is 75% the Europeans that's the slave raiders, and maybe 25% the Indians. So I think happened. I don't think that the Indians were the only ones doing it, but they wrote it to make it look like it was Indians the only ones doing the capturing. I believe it was mostly the Europeans. But that's just my point of view, because everything in the slave trade has been told in reverse. So I'm inclined to think the opposite of what was told, because it was done to justify slavery and racism in this country, and to keep the narrative and try to keep gray supremacy alive. And whitewashing everything and graywash everything to make it look like grades are perfect when they're not. So, but this is my take on it. I analyzed this entire article. It's my take on it. Please like this video and thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. And I'll, love to hear from you. And till next time, peace and be blessed. Bye bye.